Captain Elias Carter gritted his teeth as his escape pod shook violently, breaking through the thick clouds of the unknown planet. Sparks burst from the control panel, warning lights flashing red. His ship, the starbound Voyager, was gone, lost in a freak accident during a hyperspace jump. Now all he had was this tiny burning pod and a hope that he wouldn't crash straight into an ocean of acid. The moment the pod slammed into the surface, dust and debris exploded into the air. Silence followed. Elias groaned, unstrapping himself and prying the emergency hatch open. As he stumbled out, his boots sank slightly into the soft, purple-hued sand. The sky above was a strange mix of deep orange and swirling blue, with twin suns hanging lazily on the horizon. A new world. He tapped his wrist communicator. Dead signal. No way to contact anyone. No way to call for help. Great, he muttered. Just great. Then he noticed them. Figures stood in the distance, half hidden by the hazy air. At first, he thought they were floating, but as they moved closer, he realized the truth. They had no legs. They glided across the ground using small, levitating appendages, their elongated torsos draped in shimmering robes. Their faces were smooth, almost serene, with large, luminous eyes. They whispered among themselves in a language he didn't understand. Elias raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Hey there," he called out cautiously. "I come in peace. Just a little lost, that's all." Then something unexpected happened. One of the figures, an elderly being covered in golden patterns, fell to the ground in a deep bow. The others followed instantly, lowering themselves before him, their floating limbs retracting as they pressed their bodies into the sand. Elias blinked. Okay, not what I was expecting." More of them emerged from the distance, some rushing forward, others crying out in what sounded like awe. A young one, barely reaching Elias's waist in height, pointed at his legs and spoke in an urgent, almost reverent tone. The elder responded, his voice trembling with emotion. Elias looked down at himself. His legs. They were staring at his legs. Before he could process what was happening, the crowd began chanting a single word, over and over. The translation in his universal earpiece struggled at first, but then, after a few moments, it clicked into something he understood. Skyborn. Elias frowned. Skyborn. The elder, still bowing, raised his voice. His words carried through the air with undeniable authority. The gathered crowd gasped, trembled, and some even wept as they repeated his declaration. The earpiece translated. "The Skyborn has returned." Elias ran a hand through his short, dust-covered hair. Well, that's new. He had been prepared for hostility. He had been ready to run, to fight if necessary. He had not been prepared to be worshipped. A soft hand touched his arm. The elder was looking up at him now, his ancient eyes filled with something Elias couldn't quite name. Hope, fear, devotion. "You are Valor," the elder whispered. The translation took a second. Elias sighed. "I'm really not." The elder ignored him and turned to the crowd. His voice rose. "The prophecy is fulfilled. The Skyborn walks once more." The air filled with cries of joy, a deep, echoing chant rolling through the people like a wave. The young one who had first pointed at Elias rushed forward, wrapping their floating appendages around his leg in something like an embrace. Others followed, touching his boots with trembling hands. Elias took a cautious step back. The moment he did, the entire crowd gasped. Some fell prostrate again, hands outstretched toward him. He looked up at the twin suns, squinting. "Oh boy," he muttered. "This just got complicated." At that moment, the sound of deep, distant drums filled the air. From beyond the dunes, a group of armored figures emerged. Unlike the rest, they wore dark ceremonial robes, their floating appendages surrounded by shimmering rings of light. Their faces were covered by ornate masks, their bodies stiff with formality. The crowd parted instantly, bowing low. Elias didn't need a translator to understand what was happening. These were leaders, priests, and they had just come to see their so-called Skyborn. The tallest of them stepped forward. His voice was deep and heavy, dripping with authority. "You will come with us," he declared. Elias glanced at the hundreds of kneeling people, then at the armed figures waiting for his response. He sighed again. Yeah, figured that was coming. And with that, the human who could walk was taken to meet the rulers of a world that worshipped his every step. Elias walked carefully, his boots pressing into the soft sand, as the armored figures led him toward an enormous stone city in the distance. The twin suns bathed the towering structures in golden light, their smooth curved surfaces reflecting a soft glow. Strange symbols and carvings decorated the buildings, depicting figures without legs bowing before a being who stood tall, just like him. The people whispered and pointed as he passed. Some pressed their hands together in prayer, others dropped to their knees. The weight of their stares made Elias uneasy. "Great," he muttered, "stranded on a planet where my legs make me a god." The high priestess, Jalura, a tall figure draped in silver robes, walked beside him. Unlike the others, her face was uncovered, revealing deep violet skin and piercing golden eyes. She held an ornate staff, its tip glowing faintly. "You have returned, just as the prophecy foretold," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet intensity. Elias sighed. "I keep telling you, I'm not this." He hesitated, then tried the name they kept using. "Valor." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You do not remember your past life. That is expected. The Skyborn always returns in a new form, unaware of his divine duty." Elias frowned. Past life. They actually believed he was the reincarnation of some ancient being. As they entered the city, Elias took in the massive gathering of people waiting in the central plaza. Thousands stood in silent reverence, their glowing eyes locked on him. At the far end of the plaza, a massive stone temple loomed, its entrance guarded by warriors in jet-black robes. Jalura gestured toward the temple. "The Council of Oracles awaits you. They must confirm your divinity." Elias sighed. Why does this always happen in old legends? Some poor fool lands on an alien world, gets mistaken for a god, and then things get complicated. Still, he had no other options. If he wanted to survive here, he needed answers. The trial of the Skyborn. Inside the temple, the air was cool, filled with the scent of burning incense. Enormous murals covered the walls, each depicting moments from the prophecy, the coming of the Skyborn, his trials, and his victory over darkness. At the far end, 5 ancient figures sat on raised platforms, their floating appendages glowing faintly with energy. Their robes were adorned with symbols of power, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. The Council of Oracles. Elias stopped at the center of the chamber. Silence fell. One of the oracles, an elder with a voice like shifting sand, spoke. "You have returned at last." Another oracle raised a staff. "The world is in peril. The great balance is threatened. If you are truly the Skyborn, you will restore order." Elias folded his arms. "And if I'm not?" A long pause. Then the eldest oracle spoke. "Then you will die." The room grew colder. Elias resisted the urge to curse. "Fantastic." Jalura stepped forward, addressing the council. "The people have seen him walk. They believe. But we must be sure." She turned to Elias. "You must pass the trial." Elias exhaled slowly. There was always a trial. "What kind of trial are we talking about?" he asked. One of the oracles gestured, and the floor beneath Elias shifted with a deep, rumbling sound. The ground split open, revealing a massive pit, its depths filled with an eerie blue mist. "The trial of the Skyborn," Jalura said. "If you are truly Valor reborn, you will walk across the path of the divine without falling." Elias looked down. From the mist, thin stone pillars rose, each spaced just far enough apart that he would have to jump from one to the next. The oracles floated effortlessly over the ground. They had never needed legs. Elias, on the other hand, had spent his entire life using them. He smirked. "All right, now this. This I can handle." He took a deep breath and stepped onto the first pillar. The stone wobbled beneath him, but he steadied himself. He moved to the next, his balance sharp, his muscles controlled. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Jump after jump, he crossed the impossible path, each leap proving what they already believed. He was something beyond them, something divine. Finally, he reached the other side. He turned, arms crossed. "So, do I pass?" The oracles stared. Then, the eldest one slowly bowed his head. "The Skyborn walks," he said. The gathered crowd erupted into cheers and chants, the entire temple shaking with their devotion. Elias exhaled in relief. He wasn't sure what would have happened if he failed, but he wasn't eager to find out. Chalura stepped forward, her eyes filled with something new. Not just belief. Respect. "You have proven yourself," she said. "Now you must fulfill your purpose." Elias tensed. He had survived the trial, but something told him this was only the beginning. "What exactly is this purpose?" he asked. The eldest oracle's voice echoed through the chamber. "To save Varith from destruction." Elias's stomach dropped. Well, that escalated quickly. Elias Carter sat on a high stone balcony, staring out at the sprawling city of Varith below. Thousands of glowing lanterns floated through the air, lighting up the curved buildings and wide sand-covered streets. The people still gathered outside the temple, chanting his name, their voices rising like a song carried by the wind. He rubbed his temples. How did I end up here? Hours ago, he was just a stranded pilot. Now, he was the so-called Skyborn, a figure of prophecy who had supposedly returned to save this world from destruction. But what was he actually supposed to do? A soft voice broke his thoughts. "You have given them hope." Elias turned to see High Priestess Chalura, her silver robes glowing faintly under the twin moons. She stepped beside him, gazing at the city with a distant look in her golden eyes. Elias exhaled. "I didn't do anything special. I just walked. For us, that is special." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You may not accept it, but to our people, you are divine." Elias shook his head. "I'm not a god." Chalura studied him for a moment. "Then what are you?" He hesitated. "A survivor. A lost traveler. Just a human." Nothing, he said, would matter to them. They had already made up their minds. Instead, he asked, "What exactly is this destruction your people keep talking about?" Chalura's expression darkened. "You will see soon." She led him through the temple corridors, past ancient murals carved into the stone. The images told a story, a golden age where the Skyborn guided the people, followed by war, disaster, and a time of darkness. The last carving showed a lone figure standing against a great storm, his legs firmly planted on the ground while the people knelt before him. They reached a hidden chamber, its walls lined with strange, floating devices covered in glowing symbols. In the center, a large crystal sphere hovered above the ground, pulsing with dim light. "This is the Eye of Varith," Chalura said. "It sees beyond what we can." She waved a hand over the sphere. Instantly, the surface rippled, revealing an image of the planet's horizon. Elias's breath caught. A massive storm loomed in the distance, stretching across the land like a living thing. It wasn't just wind and dust. It was something unnatural. The sky within the storm twisted with dark energy, and the land beneath it was cracking apart, swallowed by shifting sand. Elias stepped closer. What is that?" Chalura's voice was grim. "The veil of unmaking. It consumes everything in its path. It is the same force that nearly destroyed our world in ancient times." Elias stared at the storm. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. "And you think I can stop it?" "The prophecy says the Skyborn will restore balance." Elias ran a hand through his hair. Great. No pressure. But then, something clicked in his mind. That storm, does it have a source? He asked. Zalura nodded. The Pillars of Valor, ancient machines that once kept our world in harmony, but they have long since fallen into ruin. Elias frowned. Machines. Now they were talking about technology. Something tangible. Something real. Has anyone tried to fix them? Zalura hesitated. None have dared. The Council of Oracles forbids it. Elias narrowed his eyes. Why? Before she could answer, a loud boom echoed through the temple. The doors burst open, and a squad of armored warriors stormed in, their robes marked with the black insignia of the council's enforcers. At their head stood a tall, imposing figure in crimson robes. His face was hidden behind a dark mask, his voice sharp as steel. You have defied the will of the council, Zalura. She stood firm. Archseer Norik. Elias felt the tension crackling in the air. He had seen power struggles before, and this had all the markings of one. Norik turned his masked face toward Elias. You do not belong here, outsider. The fate of Varith is not yours to decide. Elias folded his arms. Pretty sure your people already decided for me. Norik's voice was low and dangerous. You walk, but that does not make you divine. Elias smirked. You're right. I'm not a god. But if your world is dying, maybe it's time you listen to someone who can actually fix things. Norik's masked face betrayed no emotion. You will do nothing. The prophecy will unfold as it must. Elias clenched his fists. He had seen this before. People so devoted to tradition that they refused to act, even when disaster stared them in the face. So you're just going to let that storm destroy everything? He challenged. Norik's voice was like ice. If that is what the gods will, then so be it. Elias took a slow breath. He had heard enough. He turned to Zalura. Take me to the machines. Norik took a step forward. You will do no such thing. Elias met his gaze. Try and stop me. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then Norik turned to his warriors. Seize him. Elias moved first. He grabbed the nearest warrior's arm and twisted, using his full weight to throw the attacker off balance. Before the others could react, he was already moving, kicking another back with a sharp strike to the chest. Zalura summoned a pulse of energy from her staff, knocking two warriors away. This way. Elias ran. His heart pounded as he followed her through the temple halls. Behind them, Norik's furious voice echoed. Stop them. The false god must not escape. As they burst into the open city, Elias looked up at the darkening sky. The veil of unmaking loomed on the horizon. He had no choice. If this world was going to survive, he had to find those machines. And he had to fix them before it was too late. Elias ran through the winding streets of Varith, his boots kicking up sand as he followed Zalura into the city's outer districts. The shouts of Norik's enforcers echoed behind them, but the people of the city, his so-called believers, blocked the soldiers' path, kneeling and chanting his name. They won't harm the faithful, Zalura said as they ducked into a narrow alleyway. But we must move quickly. The Archseer will not stop his hunt. Elias exhaled, adjusting the straps on his survival pack. You still haven't told me. Where exactly are these pillars? Zalura pointed toward the far horizon, where the veil of unmaking churned like a living storm. Beyond the glass wastes, in the heart of the forbidden expanse. Elias sighed. Of course it's in a place called the Forbidden Expanse. Why wouldn't it be? Zalura allowed herself a small smile. The journey will be dangerous. The storm grows stronger, and the land is cursed with ruins from the old world. But if we do not reach the Pillars of Valor, there will be no world left to save. Elias ran a hand through his short hair, looking up at the swirling clouds in the distance. He had come to this planet by accident. Now he was about to risk his life for it. But he wasn't the kind of man to walk away from people who needed him. All right. he said. Let's go. The desert beyond the city. They left Verith under the cover of darkness, traveling on skimmer beasts, large, sleek creatures that glided over the sand with smooth, silent movements. The creatures responded to Jalura's gentle commands, moving swiftly across the desert. Elias clung to the reins as the cold night air rushed past him. The twin moons hung overhead, casting an eerie glow over the dunes. After hours of riding, the golden sands turned to shattered glass, reflecting the sky like a broken mirror. The glass wastes. This place used to be a great city, Jalura said, her voice heavy with sorrow, until the first storm consumed it. Elias looked around at the remnants of crumbling towers, their frames twisted and burned as if melted by an unimaginable force. He frowned. What exactly caused the first storm? Jalura hesitated, then said, "The pillars of Valor were built in the time of the first Skyborn. They kept the balance between nature and energy. But when he disappeared, the balance failed. The storms came, and the world suffered." Elias absorbed this information. If these pillars were some kind of ancient technology, then maybe, just maybe, he could fix them. But before he could ask more, a deep rumble shook the ground. Jalura tensed. We are not alone. The creatures of the wastes. From the shadows of the ruined towers, something moved. Elias narrowed his eyes as twisted figures emerged from the wreckage. Skull-faced creatures with elongated limbs and glowing blue eyes. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were puppets pulled by unseen strings. Elias instinctively reached for the small plasma cutter strapped to his belt. What are they? Jalura's voice was low, hollowed. Those who wandered too close to the storm and lost their souls. The creatures let out a hollow, echoing wail and charged forward. Elias didn't hesitate. He leaped from his skimmer beast, rolling as he hit the ground. One of the creatures lunged at him, but he dodged, swinging the plasma cutter in a wide arc. The blade sizzled as it cut through the hollowed's brittle frame, sending it collapsing into the sand. Jalura lifted her staff, summoning a pulse of energy that sent several of the creatures flying. But more kept coming, crawling out from the ruins like insects. We can't fight them all, Elias shouted. Jalura nodded. We run. They leaped back onto their skimmer beasts, urging the creatures forward. The hollowed screeched in frustration, but they could not match the speed of the skimmers. Soon, the ruins were behind them, the nightmare fading into the night, the guardian of the pillars. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, they had reached the edge of the forbidden expanse. Before them stood an enormous canyon, its walls carved with ancient symbols. At its center, half buried in sand, were the pillars of Valor, towering structures of stone and metal, humming with a faint dying energy. Elias felt a surge of hope. If those were machines, there was a chance he could repair them. But as they approached, the ground trembled. A deep, resonating voice echoed through the canyon. Who dares enter the domain of the Skyborn? A massive figure emerged from the shadows, a towering mechanical guardian, its body covered in intricate golden armor. Its eyes burned with blue fire, and in its hand, it held a spear of pure energy. Elias groaned. Of course, there's always a guardian. Jalura dismounted her skimmer. This is the Sentinel of Valor. It was built to protect the pillars from those who would misuse their power. The Sentinel raised its spear. The Skyborn must prove his worth, or be destroyed. Elias glanced at Jalura. Any chance we can talk our way past it? She shook her head. No. Elias sighed and rolled his shoulders. All right then, he muttered, stepping forward. Let's do this. Elias took a deep breath, staring up at the Sentinel of Valor. The massive guardian stood unmoving, its golden armor gleaming under the rising sun. In its hands, the spear of energy pulsed with raw power. The Skyborn must prove his worth, or be destroyed. Elias exhaled, muttering under his breath. Great. A giant, ancient robot wants to fight me. Shalura stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. The Sentinel was created to test those who seek the pillars. If you fail, it will not spare you. Elias gave a dry chuckle. No pressure, ha. The Sentinel raised its spear and slammed it into the ground. The entire canyon trembled. Symbols on the stone walls glowed, and a massive ring of light formed around the battlefield. Elias stepped forward cautiously. All right, big guy. Let's get this over with. The Sentinel charged. The battle begins. Elias barely dodged as the energy spear struck the ground where he had stood a moment before. The impact sent a shockwave through the canyon, throwing dust and debris into the air. He rolled to the side and pulled out his plasma cutter. It wasn't much against a massive guardian, but it was all he had. The Sentinel swung its spear, forcing Elias to duck. He scrambled backward, trying to find an opening. Think, Carter. You can't fight this thing head-on. His eyes flickered to the symbols on the walls, glowing brighter each time the Sentinel attacked. Was there a pattern? A weakness? The Sentinel lunged again. Elias barely managed to leap aside, but the weapon's energy clipped his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his body. Shalura shouted from the sidelines. The Sentinel is bound to the ancient runes. Use them. Elias's mind clicked. The glowing symbols. They were more than decorations. They were part of the machine. If he could disrupt them, maybe he could shut the Sentinel down. A different strategy. Elias darted toward the nearest wall, dodging another attack from the Sentinel. He pressed his hand against one of the glowing runes. Nothing happened. The Sentinel turned, its fiery blue eyes locking onto him. It raised its spear for a final strike. Elias acted on instinct. Instead of running, he slammed his plasma cutter into the rune, sending a surge of energy through the ancient system. The rune flickered and died. The Sentinel staggered, its movements suddenly jerky, uncoordinated. Elias grinned. Oh, so that did something. Shalura's voice rang out. The runes power the trial. Shut them down, and the battle will end. Elias didn't need to be told twice. The final strike. Dodging another attack, he sprinted toward the second rune, using his plasma cutter to short-circuit it. The Sentinel roared, its energy flickering wildly. It tried to strike again, but its movements were slower, more sluggish. Elias made his way to the final rune. He could feel the ground shaking beneath his feet, the Sentinel desperately trying to regain control. With one final swing, Elias disabled the last rune. The Sentinel froze mid-strike. Its energy flickered, and the spear dissolved into thin air. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, with a loud clang, the massive guardian knelt before him, lowering its head. Shalura approached cautiously. You have passed the trial, Elias Carter. The Sentinel's eyes dimmed slightly as it spoke once more. You are worthy. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was intense. Shalura smiled. And yet, you prevailed. The massive stone doors behind the Sentinel began to open, revealing a hidden chamber beneath the pillars of Valor. Elias dusted himself off and grinned. All right, let's go fix the world. Elias stepped through the massive stone doors, his breath catching as he entered the hidden chamber beneath the pillars of Valor. The air was thick with the scent of ancient machinery, the soft hum of dormant energy filling the vast, dimly lit space. Towering structures of metal and stone stretched toward the ceiling, each one etched with glowing symbols. At the center of the chamber stood a massive control console, its surface covered in dust and cracked screens. Shalura followed close behind, her eyes wide with awe. We stand in the sanctuary of the first Skyborn. This place has been untouched for centuries. Elias ran a hand over the control panel, brushing away layers of dust. Let's hope it still works. The system awakens. He crouched down, examining the ancient interface. The symbols looked familiar, a mix of alien script and universal logic. Elias had seen plenty of old tech in his time, And while this was beyond anything he had worked with, some parts looked fixable. He pressed a button. A low rumble shook the chamber. Jalura gasped as the symbols on the walls flickered to life, casting a soft blue glow across the space. The console let out a series of mechanical clicks, and suddenly, a holographic figure appeared before them. It was tall, featureless, made of shimmering light. A voice echoed in the chamber, deep and ancient. "The Skyborn has returned, but the world is broken." Elias straightened. "Yeah, I noticed that. Any idea how to fix it?" The hologram pulsed. "The pillars of Valor maintain the balance. Their power is fading. Without restoration, the storms will consume all." Jalura turned to Elias, her expression serious. "You must restore the power, or the planet will be lost." A race against time. Elias scanned the console, his mind working quickly. "All right, I see the problem. The energy cores are failing. They need a jumpstart." Jalura nodded. "Can you do it?" Elias exhaled. "I can try." He pulled out his multi-tool, adjusting the settings. If he could reroute power through the control circuits, he might be able to reactivate the pillars. But the system was ancient. It could overload, or worse, collapse completely. As he began his work, the ground trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Jalura's eyes widened. "What is happening?" The holographic figure spoke again. "The storm draws near. The final collapse approaches." Elias cursed under his breath. They were running out of time. He worked faster, bypassing the damaged circuits and rewiring the power conduits. The symbols on the console glowed brighter, and the hum of energy grew stronger. But then, a warning light flashed red. The final choice. Elias gritted his teeth. Something's blocking the full activation. Jalura studied the symbols. The system is rejecting the restart. The holographic figure's voice deepened. "Only the Skyborn may complete the cycle. A sacrifice is required." Elias frowned. "Sacrifice?" The hologram's light flickered. "To restore balance, the Skyborn must share his essence." Elias felt a sinking feeling. "Let me guess. This thing thinks I'm Skyborn because of my legs, right?" Jalura nodded slowly. "The legends say the Skyborn's essence is what powers the pillars." Elias sighed. "Great. And what happens if I do this?" The hologram pulsed. "Your life force will be bound to the world. You will remain, but you will never leave." Elias froze. If he activated the system, he could save the planet, but he might never be able to return to space, never see Earth again. He looked at Jalura. Her people, her world, depended on this. If he didn't do it, the storms would consume everything. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, then made his choice. "All right," he said. "Let's do this. Restoring the pillars." Elias placed his hands on the console. The symbols beneath his fingers flared to life, and a surge of energy shot through his body. He clenched his jaw as he felt something shifting inside him, a deep connection forming between himself and the planet. The pillars roared to life, sending beams of energy into the sky. Outside, the raging storms began to calm. The skies cleared, and the world seemed to breathe again. Jalura watched in awe. "You did it." Elias stepped back, his body trembling, his breath uneven. He felt different. The holographic figure faded, leaving only a final message. "The Skyborn endures. The world is restored." Elias exhaled. He was still alive, but he could feel it. He was now connected to Valor in a way he couldn't fully understand. Jalura stepped forward, her expression filled with gratitude. "You saved us." Elias managed a tired smile. "Yeah, but I think I just became part of your world." She placed a hand over her heart, bowing deeply. "Then Valor is honored." Outside, the new dawn rose. The storms gone. The world was safe. But Elias knew his journey on Valor had only just begun. Elias stood at the entrance of the chamber, watching the sky above. For the first time since his arrival, the dark storms were gone. The sky was clear and blue, stretching endlessly over the land of Valor. The people would be safe now. The world was at peace. But deep inside, Elias felt different. Something had changed in him. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. His body felt the same, yet not entirely. The connection to the planet was real. He could feel a pulse beneath his feet, as if Valor itself was alive and breathing with him. Shalura stepped beside him, gazing at the sky with quiet awe. "It is a new beginning," she said. "Because of you." Elias chuckled. "Yeah, guess I'm stuck here now." She turned to him, her expression both grateful and serious. "You are not stuck, Elias Carter. You are part of us now, the Skyborn of Valor." The people gather. Word of the restored pillars spread faster than the wind. By the time Elias and Shalura returned to the city, hundreds of people had gathered in the great square. They cheered when they saw him, chanting in their language. Elias couldn't understand their words, but he didn't need to. The joy on their faces said it all. The high elders stood waiting at the base of the temple, their golden robes shimmering in the sunlight. The oldest among them stepped forward, bowing deeply. "You have done what no other could, Skyborn," the elder said. "Valor owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Elias scratched the back of his head. No need for all that. Just doing what needed to be done." The elder smiled. "A true Skyborn does not seek reward. And yet, your presence here has changed everything. A new purpose." As the celebrations continued, Elias slipped away from the crowd, standing at the edge of the city. He stared at the horizon, lost in thought. He had come to Valor by accident. He had planned to fix his ship, leave, and never look back. But now he was part of this world. Shalura found him there, silent. "You are troubled." Elias sighed. "I don't know what comes next." She studied him for a moment. The pillars are restored, but the world still needs a guide, someone to protect the balance. Elias chuckled. "You're saying I have a new job?" Shalura smiled. "If you choose to accept it." He thought about it. He had spent years drifting from planet to planet, never staying in one place too long. But for the first time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The planet had accepted him, just as its people had. Maybe it was time he accepted it too. He turned to Shalura and grinned. "All right then. Let's see what being a Skyborn is all about." The legend begins. Over the next few weeks, Elias learned more about Valor than he ever thought possible. The people welcomed him as one of their own, and Shalura guided him through their ancient traditions. He discovered that the energy of the pillars now flowed through him. It gave him an awareness of the planet's balance. When something was wrong, he could feel it. When a distant village needed help, he was the first to arrive. When the land began to shift, he could sense the change before it happened. Slowly, the people of Valor stopped calling him the outsider. Instead, they called him Guardian of the Skyborn. And so, the legend began. A final message. One evening, Elias returned to the ancient chamber of the pillars. He placed a hand on the control console, feeling the hum of energy beneath his fingers. The holographic figure appeared once more, its voice calm. "You have chosen your path, Elias Carter." He smirked. "Guess I have." The figure pulsed. "The Skyborn endures. Valor is safe. But remember, balance must always be maintained." Elias nodded. "I'll take care of it." As the hologram faded, Elias looked up at the sky once more. He had come to this world by accident, but now he had a purpose. The storms had ended, and a new future had begun. And so, Elias Carter, the Skyborn of Valor, took his first step into destiny.